The children of the Cailleach. They say that something came out of the North Sea before it was the North Sea, long before the vast tsunami that swept the east coast clean of human life, and it's been living in Bankery Forest ever since. In those days, it was all woods and grassland, and you could walk all the way to Denmark. Nowadays, everything's penned in by seas and roads and cities, but there are still forests up there that you can wander in till you die, and whatever lived in them still does. Our people's ancestors called them the Clan na Cailleach, but the ancestors of our ancestors had a different name for them. Those folk knew more, and their stories went back to the land under the sea. Those were the days when you had to travel in groups and be sure to take your spear and your dogs because of the things that lived in the forests. We find bodies out there, and that's good, because we know they haven't been taken. It's when you do sweep searches for days and find nothing that the fear sets in. The old stories come back to haunt you, and a dread of the forest fills you once again. You probably see me as a daft old man, but I was with Search and Rescue for more than 20 years, and I don't give a toss what you think. There's something in those woods. It's ancient, it's evil, and it takes people. I bet they wouldn't even let you see the reports. They're all confidential to protect the victims' families. Aye, right. I'll tell you about one we had back in 1989. That's the one where we lost Finlay. A German family had gone camping in the forest, as they do, always think they know best, and the wife came storming into the police station in Bankery. She'd already been shouting at folk in Ochati, and then turned the wrong way when she crossed the river and driven all the way out to Bridgecany. Anyway, she came in with the kids, shouting that her husband had run off or fallen into a deer pit. We laughed at first, mainly at the deer pit idea, but it turned out he'd only been yards from their tent, getting water from the wee burn they'd camped beside. 10, 15 yards maybe. It had been about 7 in the morning, and the mist had come rolling in through the night. It was a thick one, and that's what put the first shiver up me and started me thinking of the old tales, always at night or in the mist. You've heard of the big grey man of Ben Macdooey, an impossibly tall, spindly, lanky figure that strides around waving its arms. Well, it's supposed to be like that, tall, grey, thin and mad. Maybe that's why it likes the mist. Who knows? None of the stories describe its face. Maybe it doesn't have one, or maybe, by the time you're that close, it's too late. Anyway, the mum told us she and the kids, a girl of 9 and a boy of 13, had searched and searched for 2 hours. They'd covered every inch of ground for a quarter mile about, and all they'd found was his water flask. That's when Finlay Cruikshank piped up. "Yon loon's dead," he told us. "The wifey here's done him in down the woods and she's covering her tracks." There was some laughter, but quite a few serious faces. We'd had something similar happen about 5 years before that turned out to be a murder. But that was just the start. Turned out the wifey had more English than we'd thought, and she'd got the gist of what Finlay had said. She went ape, and Finlay was on the back foot for sure. He had to backpedal big time and try and calm her down. "Dinna fash, Quine," he was holding his palms up. "I didn't mean to insult ye. If I did, I'm awfully sorry. What I meant was we hae to look into often here, but we'll still be out searching all the same. There's nae muckle difference when you're looking for a stiff." You can only imagine how it went from there, but we eventually got things calmed down and got the details and last known location of the missing person. The teams were called together, and we drove out to the scene, which turned out to be way out past Finzine, up near the Altdunny along Fungal Road. The mist was still down, and the place was disorienting as hell, creepy too. No landmarks, just trees everywhere, tall grey silhouettes in the mist everywhere you looked. Thing is, we kept driving and she just kept saying no, no. She had got completely turned around, and we ended up taking old forestry tracks as far as the Burna Booney. You can laugh, but it was the boonies all right. Nothing for miles but the forest, flat land and a few streams. If you had one of those to navigate by, you were lucky, because they all ended up in the River Dee eventually. It was mid-afternoon till we found their tent and the scene was just as she had described, with a little stream about 15 yards away. The woman showed us where she had found her husband's flask, and the kids ran to pick up their Walkman. We could see that the ground had been pretty well trampled all around the tent, but the farther away you got, the fresher things were. Some of us were ghillies and trackers, and we kept everyone else back while we slowly examined the ground in detail, taking our sweet time about it. We walked outwards in a spiral pattern from the tent until we got to the burn, and that's when things started to get weird. We had identified the husband's tracks, and, sure enough, we found some down at the wee stream. They seemed to cross it at one point and start out away from the tent, but then they just stopped. I don't mean he stood still or turned around. I mean they simply disappeared. I think Finlay was the first one to notice that. He was always the best of us, but he said nothing until Archie Sangster and I also came to a stop and began looking at each other. "Aye," Finlay said quietly, before getting down on his belly and squinting at the ground all around the area where the tracks stopped. After about 20 minutes, he stood up, stretched out his back, then indicated an area and said, "What do you think, boys?" While Archie and I crawled around on our bellies, Finlay sat down against a tree and rolled a cigarette. He was finished it before we were done. I couldn't see anything at first, but that's because I was looking in the wrong way. I was looking for human or animal tracks, a certain range of shapes and sizes, things I was familiar with. But when I simply lay down and looked at the depressions in the turf, I began to see what had got Finlay's attention. There was a series of shallow depressions in the ground, only just visible and about 20 inches long. If you studied them very carefully, they were roughly shaped like a human foot, but one that had been distorted in a hall of mirrors, long and narrow. Sometimes you thought you could make out toes, mostly not. They were spaced around 3 to 4 yards apart. That was the step length right to left, and they appeared to be coming in from the far reaches of the forest. They stopped about 5 yards from where the husband's prints disappeared, and then turned around and made back in roughly the direction they had come. Were they deeper, like whatever made them was carrying something? Maybe. All three of us exchanged long looks before anyone said anything. "We have to follow it." Finlay was the first to speak, but he wasn't giving much away. Another short silence before I said, "Aye." Archie just nodded. We were all very subdued, and I could see the colour of the other two had drained a bit. The first sweep search had been organised and was heading out at 90 degrees to our direction, so help wouldn't be that far away. "My gun's in the jeep," Finlay said, and once his deer rifle was over his shoulder, we all set out in line abreast. I carried a big skinning knife, and I know Archie did too. The going was very slow, and no one said a word as we tried to follow the nearly non-existent trail. I had a tingle between the shoulder blades and a creepy feeling of being watched. The other two were glancing over their shoulders more than usual and walking hunched up and sullen. We had all grown up around here, and I know we were all thinking along similar lines, but no one would say it. The thick mist hadn't lifted all day, and it had taken us more than an hour to cover about a mile through the forest. Now that we knew what we were looking for, the trail wasn't impossible, but it was still faint and difficult, making for slow going. The day was wearing on, and I had begun thinking about the dark. "Anyone bring a torch?" I asked in a quiet voice. They were the first words any of us had spoken since we started out. Finlay gave a little snort of laughter. "Aye," he said. Archie shook his head. "That's one of us then," I commented, and Finlay gave a faint smile. "Frightened of the dark?" he taunted. "Scared the bogle will get you?" In all honesty, I was, but I wasn't going to admit that here, to these men. Perhaps I should have, but it was Archie who replied. "It's no a bogle, Finlay," he hissed, then even quieter. "You know you shouldn't joke about na Jan you didn't call." "Wheesht, man," Finlay snapped. He looked angry, but whether at Archie or himself it was impossible to tell. I was still surprised at what I had just heard. Around here, we don't usually talk about them, and if we do, we almost never name them. The only times I had heard them referred to by the oldsters, they had been called Clan Cailleach, children of the hag. But what Archie had said was different. It was Gaelic all right, but it meant the children of the forest. Was that an older name? From a time before the old Celtic gods held sway over the north? Finlay was angry and Archie looked embarrassed. So I did as we always do and kept my mouth shut. Whatever we were tracking, it certainly wasn't a child. After another hour, the light was beginning to fade, and we thought about turning back. We should have, but the trail was still leading us on, and we knew that by morning it would have all but vanished. So we exchanged glances, but no one said a word, and we pressed on. An hour after that, it was fully dark, and we were tracking by torchlight, which isn't as difficult as it sounds. If you hold the torch close to the ground and shine its light at a shallow angle, it can actually cause prints to stand out even more. At any rate, we were no slower. What's more, the mist appeared to have thinned a little, and there was a full moon. Its light permeated the mist and made it glow. I don't know if you've ever seen that happen, but it can be quite magical. That night, however, it was just plain creepy. Eventually, even going slow and using the torch, we lost the trail. Nothing mysterious. The ground just got harder and the trail fainter until none of us could make out anything at all. I, for one, was secretly relieved. No one had seen tracks like that before, and we all had a foreboding at the back of our minds that we wouldn't put into words. We sat down and scratched our heads, and I was about to say, "Let's call it a day," when Finlay beat me to the punch. "I say we head 1 more mile on the last bearing and then call it a day." Archie and I looked at each other and then reluctantly nodded. It was the worst decision I ever made. We ploughed on for a while until eventually I began to feel distinctly ill at ease. Looking at the others' faces, I could tell that they were feeling the same thing, but still no one said a word. We could see a change in the quality of light ahead, and then, all of a sudden, literally from one step to the next, I was filled with an overwhelming dread. I can't describe it any better than to say it was sheer, unreasoning terror. It swept over us from nowhere, occasioned by nothing. At the same moment, we could see that the light was changing, because we were stepping out into a clearing in the forest, maybe 100 yards across. In the weird glow of the mist, I could see a tarn in front of us, a wee lochen, perhaps half the width of the clearing, and at the opposite side of the lochen was a small knoll, perhaps 30 feet in height. The lochen had an unnaturally dark appearance, and the knoll had the size and shape of what we often call the Knockman Sheehan, or fairy mound. There are still farmers in these parts who won't set iron to the ground in such a place, except that it wore a jagged crown of dead and broken trees. Even the grass that covered it had a dark and unhealthy appearance, and the water in the lochen looked somehow thick and oily. There was a sound like wind in the trees, but the mist wasn't moving. Finlay shone his torch upward. Everything looked so still, and that whistling now sounded like a distant screaming. There were almost words. I thought I could make out a far away and drawn out "Hilfe, Hilfe." Then a deeper voice, right behind us, said "Hilfe," and laughed. We whipped around, but there was nothing there. When Archie and I turned back, Finlay was gone, his torch lying on the wet ground. Our eyes had been off him for only 2 or 3 seconds. There had been no sound, no scream, nothing. I picked up his torch and shouted "Finlay" at the top of my lungs, and as Archie followed suit, I caught a glimpse of movement on top of the mound. It was anything but clear, but I swear it looked like an impossibly tall, implausibly spindly being climbing down into the ground, waving its arms in a hideous frenzy. There was nowhere near us for anyone or anything to hide or run to. It was completely impossible for Finlay to hide or have been hidden during the time he was out of our sight. Then, the worst of all, Finlay's voice within that awful whistling sound. There were only 3 words, but they got louder and louder as if the source of the voice was rushing towards us. The last words I heard Finlay Cruikshank utter were, "Run, run, run!" To our everlasting shame, we did just that. We bolted. I held Finlay's torch, and we weren't tracking anything now. We ran back the way we had come, and there was a loud, deep groan like a ship's timbers about to burst. It sounded as if it came from under the ground, beneath our feet, and we couldn't seem to reach the timberline at the edge of the clearing. "Come on," I gasped, and pushed Archie between his shoulders. I had never seen my friend's face contorted like that before. It was deeply shocking. I'm telling you, we sprinted for a good 5 minutes without ever getting any closer to the trees, while the laughing and groaning came from beneath and behind us. It was only when, in a last desperate and unconscious act, I grabbed Archie's hand and we struggled together that we were suddenly among the trees. Not just among trees, but a good half of the way back to where we had started, at that poor German family's tent. Not long before we reached it, we heard people calling our names, and we answered with more relief than I have words to express. It was the others. They had completed a big sweep search, covering one whole quadrant of the designated area. They found nothing. When they inevitably asked us where Finlay had got to, Archie and I exchanged a glance. "We got separated around 3 miles out," I said. "I don't think any of us know that part of the country well. We're more from the east of here." There is an unwritten rule in search and rescue that you don't talk about the weird things, and there are more of those than you might think, except after a few pints at the Christmas do, and then only to close friends. The guys went into a huddle, and the only ghillie from out that way told us, "There's a lot of bogs and sinkholes out there. How well does Finlay know the land?" "About as well as we do," I replied, and the ghillie sighed. "Bugger," he decided, "we'd better do a search." "Do you two know where you separated?" Now I could be confident. "Yes," I replied. "We've got known bearings and distances. We can go straight there." So we headed back into that endless forest, feeling a little better now that we had numbers on our side. Everyone had a head torch as well as a handheld lamp, and we made plenty of noise, which kept our spirits up. We reversed our bearings and headed straight for the dark Lochen with its menacing mound, walking line abreast so that we spread out over a third of a mile as we advanced. To cut a long story short, we didn't find it. Not that night, the next day, nor any of the next 3 days. A helicopter was called in from RAF Lossiemouth, and it spent the best part of a day mowing the lawn over the entire area. There was no clearing, no Lochen, no mound. Now I understand the look the local ghillie had given me when I had described the eerie clearing and its mysterious knock. He knew this land as well as I know my own patch, and he had never seen the place. Despite repeated searches, we never found Finlay's remains, nor those of the German tourist. Archie and I came in for quite a bit of ribbing because of our police report, which had to state at least the bare facts in terms of times, distances and locations. The younger guys would wave their hands and go, "Woo!" Then, sure enough, at the Christmas do, I ended up having to tell the story again, this time to an audience of 2, a police inspector who had more than a passing acquaintance with macabre tales, and an old-time search and rescue teammate, Donald Gunn, who was retiring that night. Donald's face had gone almost white when I got to the part about the menacing clearing and the knock, with its broken crown of dead trees, and he abruptly got up and walked away as I began describing what we heard and saw there. The local gossip was that Donnie's father had been a drunk, and one night he'd gone wandering off into the forest. The 16-year-old Donnie had run after him when he found out, but had returned in the morning alone. Donnie's father was never seen again, and Donnie himself had been a slightly subdued individual ever since. Later, when I found him outside and we ransacked my crumpled pack of cigarettes, I thought he looked more relaxed than I had ever seen him, almost relieved. I put it down to his retirement until he placed a hand that was still very strong on my arm, looked me straight in the eye, and said quietly, "Don't ever talk about it, and pray you never find that place again." And with that, he was gone back into the raucous throng